Hello.
Hi.
Good morning.
Hi, Hazel. Good morning.
Hi. I'll give you a quick note. Hazel-Anne.
Hazel-Anne. Thank you, Hazel-Anne.
No problem.
I'm just
I'm
waiting for the
Margo.
notification that we are going live on Facebook. And once I
Hi,
get that,
Margo. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you as well, Ariane.
nice to meet you too.
Hi, Tammy.
Hi, Hazel-Anne.
It's good to see you, Tammy.
It's nice to see you as well.
So this is going to be on
Just a heads
Facebook.
up, guys. We are live streaming on Facebook. And while we're not starting the discussion just yet until we get our last person, which is Sheri, I do want to do a little introduction for people that are watching on Facebook. So hi to the WUSA 9 community. I'm Ariane Datil. You might know my face from the Q&A, which airs every night on WUSA 9 from 7 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. We also pop up all the time on digital. But today, if you guys did not know, is Black Women's Equal Pay Day. And so I am going to be leading a moderated discussion about intersectionality of race and gender in the workplace. And so I am going to introduce you to a number of amazing women, but if you're just joining us on Facebook right now, stay put and we will start the conversation soon. We're just waiting for one more panelist to join us. And I am going to bring up the comment section over here just so that I can bring in real-time comments as we're having a discussion. Everyone looks so lovely today.
Thank you, as do you.
Thank you. And then, are any of you guys friends with Sheri?
Yeah, it's Sheri.
Oh, Sheri. Well, there we go. Sheri.
Get all the
Hazel-Anne,
names right.
Sheri, Tammy Lee, and Margo.
Perfect.
Okay, we have people that are just tuning in now. For those people, I just want to let you know, again, it is Black Women's Equal Pay Day. We're going to be having a discussion about the intersectionality of race and gender in the workplace. And these are just 3 of our panelists. We have one more panelist that is going to join us. Her name is Sheri, and then we will get started. So let me know, anyone who is watching right now, what have the conversations been like about race in your workplace? Have you just been having them recently, post George Floyd, or have you been having them for the last couple of decades? I'm under the understanding that many companies have been doing diversity discussions and diversity trainings for decades, but those trainings are changing. And we're going to talk about how they're changing and why they're changing. But I also want to know what it is that you're going through every single day in your workplace. So please share those in the comments below. I see Cecile Watts is commenting. We have Meidator that's watching. Bill says, why isn't it just called Equal Pay Day for women? Well, because this is about Black women. That is why. And Sheri says, good morning, queens. So good morning to all of you queens.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We will give Sheri one more minute to join us and then we will get started. Oh, you know what? Tiffany jumped in and said, because race still matters, as does gender. That's why some people have asked why some women. Here we go. Sheri just joined us. We'll give her a second to get that video up. Hey, Sheri, can you hear us? It takes a second sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I am not generally a patient person, but this pandemic has taught me some serious patience, ladies.
Indeed.
Let's see. Hey, Sheri, can you hear us?
I can. I'm going to start my video. Yes.
Wonderful. Hi, it is so good to have you. Pin, no pin, doesn't matter.
How you doing?
But Sheri, just to give you a heads up, we are already streaming on Facebook Live now. I introduced the topic that we're talking about, which is the intersectionality of race and gender. If everyone in the background could turn off maybe their email programs, if you have any open, because they will make a lot of noise if we have them up. I get a thumbs up when everyone is good. Okay, love it. Fabulous. All right, so I'm going to start from the very beginning. We'll walk you through what we're going to talk about, who we're talking to, and then we're going to start this conversation. For the people that are watching on Facebook, comment throughout, and I will include those comments in our discussion. But just to get us started, this is not a new topic. While the pandemic and social unrest have brought about more discussions about racial injustice, and honestly, they have exacerbated and amplified the talks about inequities in the community that we have. This isn't new. And the 5 of us have been going through this our whole lives. Many of us have created careers around trying to stop some of these issues or change the way that some of workplaces are functioning right now, or not functioning, as a better word. And so I want to make sure that we're using this time, now that everyone is focused on race and inequities, to actually have people educate themselves, and then to take those learnings and create positive change in their workplaces. So I want to introduce all of our lovely panelists, our sheroes of the day. We have Sheri Davis at the bottom in our lovely peach color. Yes, okay. You are the co-director of Will Empower. It's an apprenticeship program for women that are in an early stage of their career that are involved in labor and economic justice organizations. We are going to be tapping into you a lot to talk about what it's like to actually have that mentor throughout your career and how that changes your trajectory. So we will be tapping into your resources there. Tammy Lee is joining us. She is in the polka dots up at the top, Rutgers University labor expert, and she focuses on the political and economic reform needed to achieve equitable work practices. Loved the shoulder jump. Here we go. And then we have Hazel-Anne Johnson-Marcus. She's also from Rutgers University. She is an HR expert, and she addresses emotional labor and addresses those who feel neglected or invisible in the workplace literature. And Hazel-Anne, I know you have even more depth to your work than that, but we're going to focus on the emotional labor that people have to go through when they aren't recognized in the workplace, or when they receive microaggressions or micro-inequities. That is your bread and butter, girlfriend. And then we have Margo McKay. And Margo was one of the viewers from the Q&A who reached out to us and said she wanted to be a part of this panel. And so Margo is a great find for us, a certified mediator, 10 years as a diversity director, and her primary areas of expertise are in employment law, civil rights, and equal employment opportunity. As you guys can see, we have a phenomenal panel, lots of different perspectives, and I think that's important for a conversation like this one. Colleen Kelly is saying women in general have a hard time, but instead of using women, again, here we go with the racism. I'm going to point this out early and often. Racism is something that we need to talk about. Being able to talk about intersectionality and the different parts of one's person that they bring to a conversation, that they bring to a workplace, are equally important and have a lot to do with how they perform in that workplace because of some of the inherent biases that are already there. So early and often, I will address these people who say, why are we talking about race and just women? Promise and believe it. Okay, so thank you to all of you who are joining us today. And I want to recognize that injustice is not okay. Speaking negatively about people is not okay. So I will be monitoring the comments as well. And today, like I said, we're going to be focusing on intersectionality of race and gender. And I want to start off with each of your stories, because I know you've all reached incredible heights in your careers, but that also means that at some point you've probably faced micro-inequities or microaggressions in your careers. And so Hazel-Anne, I want to start with you. How were you able to achieve that success while feeling all of these microaggressions or micro-inequities, and how did they impact your trajectory?
Thank you for having me. And I think that that is a really good question. I think all Black women in work have to struggle with the dance of how does one respond to these microaggressions, micro-inequities, because they are unfortunately inherent in our work lives. So I think the challenge is that we want to, and a lot of what I do in the HR role that I have is I teach our next generation of HR folks. And I'm trying to, I'll steal Sheri's word, empower them within their organizations to call out and to challenge these microaggressions and micro-inequities. Because often when you are the only in an organization, you feel sometimes as if, is it me? Is this in my head? And I'm fortunate that I work in an institution where there are several other folks now, where we have a community, and often it is validating to hear, oh no, it is not just you, I heard that too. So I think making it a place where it's psychologically safe for your employees to say this is not okay, and creating the kind of environment within your organization where it isn't just on your Black employees to speak up and say, hey, that was not okay. it is important for our white employees who want to be allies in pushing back against this to be able to call out those microaggressions, micro-inequities as they see them, interrupt them, if you will. Because it can't just be on the Black employees to create a better environment. It has to be a wholehearted effort.
So Tammy, I want to bring you into the conversation. What has your experience been?
Well, I guess just from listening to the question, I would want to point out that there's a very big difference between success and justice. So the things that follow Black women at every stage of their career is packaged in the system of oppression, of racial oppression. And so even when we reach the highest class, we are still not being treated as our counterparts. So we may be seen as successful. I, have my PhD, I have my law degree, I've risen to the tops in terms of job description in very many different stages of my career. But when you look at men or white women, and we look at the economic measures and social measures and cultural measures across those identities, we find that Black women, even when we're at the highest ranks, are not being treated the same way in any of those senses, economic, socially, culturally, as our counterparts. And so my research and my lived experience is always seeking justice, no matter what the class question is, and to understand more deeply that those things are inextricably linked, class and justice, and we need to rethink as corporations what it means to have equity or inclusion. It's not just naming a person who's marginalized in a position.
We are going to get back to that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more as we go on.
Absolutely. Margo.
Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you for having me. And let me just start by saying, if you want me to tell my story, my grandfather was very active in civil rights, and I watched him growing up. And I decided that, I had a couple of personal experiences in high school where pardon me?
With racism?
Probably racism, where I was skewed into a different track than where I wanted to be. But I overcame because I'm very persistent. And I just decided that, I need to work in this field. And my first job as a lawyer was in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, where I was lucky enough to touch all aspects of civil rights. Housing, education, employment, etc. I settled on the employment area as the most interesting to me, and that's sort of where I've built my career. I'm also at this point, as you mentioned, a certified mediator, and I mediate employment disputes, and a large portion of them involve claims of racial discrimination, and of course, sex discrimination as well. And those conversations are uncomfortable. The employee feels marginalized. They believe race is a factor. The manager wants to say, I'm not a racist, and gets very defensive. It's uncomfortable for everyone. But what I'm seeing recently, is very encouraging, where, and as you said, probably because we all watched George Floyd get killed right before our very eyes, but employers are recognizing that what goes on out in society does directly impact their employees, and they're reaching out, they're being proactive, they're having these discussions. And there's a way to do it safely and to be productive and not to be, scary for some people. So we'll get into that, I'm sure, but I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
We absolutely will get into that, because I want people to be able to take away from this tangible ways that they can go back to their communities, back to their offices, and be able to have these conversations about race in a way that's productive and healthy. And so Sheri, I want to go to you next. And just to remind people, she's the co-director of Will Empower, and we'll get into more of what that is in you telling us who you are and how you got there.
So thank you again for having me. And I'm really glad that we're having this conversation more. I think I probably spent a lifetime having these conversations, but in smaller spaces, to be able to have it in mainstream spaces and have it within the terms that it exists. I think oftentimes we want to talk about diversity and inclusion, but we don't want to talk about exclusion. And what I've learned along the way is that as long as we talk about including people, it feels safer than when we talk about the exclusive systems that have been set up on purpose, and that it has been built not only into the structure, but also into the culture. And so that it kind of, it manages itself. And so whether it's a person that comes in that feels like, hey, I don't identify as a racist, or I do, they do learn that what success means, what is valued. They learn those things just from being in an organization that was set up with an exclusive model. And so the challenge is to be able to say, let's put this in a historical context. Let's put this in a political context. What is the purpose of the organization? Why was it founded in the first place? Who founded the organization? Did the corporation have in mind someone like me working there at any point? Was there a struggle for someone who looks like me to work in the organization? And then once that person came in, did it change the situation? Did it open up? Did that person have support or the power to be able to make decisions that would fundamentally shift or transform that organization? And so for me, learning what I do with Will and Power, we have an apprenticeship program, but we also support emerging leaders and executive leaders, because it doesn't matter what stage you're at. We do intergenerational support, but people are still experiencing the same things that they might experience coming in the door as they are when they are leading in an organization. And so we have to actually be able to talk about these things in the terms that they exist.
Thank you for that. And we're going to stay on this line of conversation about the stages of your career. And we're going to start off with internships, because I think something that people don't think about, or maybe non-white people don't think about, is the fact that the internship process for some people can be very exclusive. And if you can't afford to move to a city where you want to further your career, you don't have access to those internships. And so I want to talk about your program. And ladies, feel free to jump in at any point in time to share how you feel about a certain topic. But this one is early entry into the workforce and how racism impacts that move. So Sheri, if we could start with you.
Yeah, so, first off, I want to acknowledge that Will and Power is a co-directed program. And my co-director is Lane Wyndham. She's at Georgetown University, and she directs the apprenticeship program. But one of the things, she's worked in DC for a long time. I used to work in DC. We understand that the first job you have can set the stage for everything that happens afterwards. And so if you don't actually come into an internship that is paid, that provides you with a mentor to start with, that gives you some tips or at least networks you might be coming into a situation alone. But the reality of it is oftentimes internships are things that are not just public. People are slotted into those positions because their neighbor has a job at such and such place. We used to laugh about DC staffers and the idea that like anybody could be a DC staffer. And it was like, DC is so unaffordable. To think that you could come here without your parents being able to pay for you to live, eat, and do everything off of the very small salary that is offered to a DC staffer is absurd. And so for us, it's like, how do you put the pieces in place so that we have activists and organizers and young strategists coming into a job with some dignity, and then not feeling like they're alone and having to figure this thing out on their own along the way. And so for us, if we give you a 3-month boost, a 6-month boost with an organization that we've done at least done some work with to know that this is going to be a good space for you to be in. We get you an internal mentor with the organization and an external mentor within the movement. Then you're not stuck thinking this is the only place you can be. You're actually able to see that there are other opportunities for me that might be more in alignment with our strengths. And we also are offering the supports of the network of Will and Power for people to know about these opportunities and be able to talk through some of the challenges.
I love that. And I love that we're talking through the challenges. I want to acknowledge one of the comments. It's from Terry Dell. And she says that it's unbelievable that we're discussing this. Her picture shows a Caucasian woman. And I think it's unbelievable that we haven't been discussing it more frequently, more in depth. And so I'm glad that we're here having this discussion. Do any of you ladies want to chime in on this topic? Hazel-Anne.
I'd like to, because I function as the HR program director for undergraduate students. And part of what I do is I help them with the internship process when they are going through it. But I think it's really important to acknowledge how many organizations, especially for-profit organizations, offer unpaid internships. And they skirt the line of the law with it, and they then expect the interns to do whatever. We monitor to make sure our students aren't exploited, but I think it is quite rampant. And often students take them because they don't have the networks that Sheri just described. So they take what they can get, even though it's not a great experience. And, you know, pre-COVID, some of these internships were in New York City, where our students in the New Brunswick area have to pay for expensive transportation into the city. So I think organizations have to do the work to think about how their policies and practices are disadvantaging those, especially from lower socioeconomic status. And that, again, intersects often with race in our country. So I think that we need to be pushing organizations to examine this, because I think and even in your profession, in journalism, I'm sure there have been many unpaid internships out there, and it's just a thing we do. But I think we have to challenge that thing we do, because then how does that disproportionately affect women of color?
Tammy Lee, you seemed like you wanted to chime in on that one.
I don't know that I could talk about internships, and I echo what Hazel-Anne and Sheri both have said about point of entry. I only would add to that it's not just the point of entry where workers of color, Black women, anyone who's in a marginalized identity is facing an obstacle, that we need that throughout our careers, and we need to have access to the networks to, number one, know about the internships, number two, have the economic capacity and other structural capacity to take advantage of the opportunity, or we like to say the opportunity to take advantage of the opportunity is part of the justice conversation we need to have. But I was actually sort of a little ready to respond to the person who wrote in about can't believe that we're talking about this. I just want to remind folks that we call allies or accomplices who may not be in the groups that we're centering today, that these conversations have always been going on. You are now part of the conversation, and that is because a lot of different things that we might talk about today, but if not, you can always send me an email about the focus on our voice. These are not things that are new. These are conversations that have been happening in particular in Black communities for a long time, or in immigrant communities for a long time, but it never was uncomfortable for white folks or the privileged groups, because we weren't made to talk about it. And I think one of the things that George Floyd did, while it's not a new situation for America, it created an opportunity for us to have our voice amplified, which is still happening and I hope continues to happen, where we have the uncomfortable conversations, uncomfortable for some, right? If it's not uncomfortable, you're not doing diversity, equity, or inclusion. I'm just gonna flat out say that, and I'm sure we can have a discussion more in depth about that.
I love that. I want to go to one of the comments. This is from Donna Calloway, and she says, in my work, my career, you are immediately dismissed if you discuss your salary with fellow employees. I did not know what others made, so how do these women know what others are earning, and do they expect to earn the same at the entry level? This is such an important conversation, because if you don't know what people make, how do you know what you should earn? Like, you can value your work, but you need to know what that monetary value is. So if you guys could discuss how you approached finding out about finances in the workplace.
Well, I think, you know, Sheri, Tammy, and myself, we're fortunate that we work at an institution where our salaries are public, so we can see what our colleagues make. But I think that speaks exactly to what we need organizations to be changing in terms of their policies. Why is it secret? Why? So if they can answer that question credibly, then we can talk. But I think they need to be doing internal pay equity studies. Why are people being paid disproportionately? Why is it a secret? And the other thing to think about, especially today on Black Women's Equal Pay Day, is why are you asking for salary history? Why are you paying attention to that? That is irrelevant to what the job is at your organization and what you should be paying people for the job. So this is where, if organizations are having these wonderful statements about, oh, we believe in equity and we believe that we want to create an environment where everybody can bring their whole and authentic selves to work, this is where they make the difference. When it comes to pay, they do the study, they clarify why people make what they make, and they stop asking about previous salary history, because that then perpetuates previous injustice.
Has anyone had those conversations with colleagues about what they make? How were you able to accurately negotiate a salary in the past?
Well, if I could just step in and just from a legal perspective say that for private sector workers, it is in fact your lawful right to discuss with other workers your wages, hours, and working conditions. It's called the National Labor Relations Act. And it's usually the federal law that allows you to form a union. Or if not, what we traditionally think of as a union like the Teamsters, for you and a group of other workers, maybe it's other women who feel like they're not getting paid the same as men, to act in concert for your mutual aid or protection. So I think people need to understand that there is a legal protection at the federal level for private sector workers. As Hazel-Anne pointed out, in the public sector, usually our salaries are published as a pay scale for the public to see. So that's easier to negotiate. But just because we have the right to do it doesn't mean that employers don't often violate that right. So you can in fact be illegally fired for banding together to talk about your salaries, but you then have a right of action in terms of seeking that. Now, when we talk about these marginalized communities, and I'm hoping we're going to talk about power, one of the things that happen is you might have a law to protect an unprotected group or underprotected group, but it's almost impossible to enforce it, or the consequences for complaining about race or gender discrimination are much higher than the remedy that's available. And that's one of the things for women, for Black women, for racially marginalized folks, that we can't in fact make the law work for us because of racism and sexism and all the other biases that we have that are built into our system.
And I do want to have that conversation about power. Sheri, did I cut you off? Were you going to say something?
No, actually, the only piece that I wanted to say is that culturally, the reason why having conversations around your wages, your salaries, or what have you, it still connects to exclusion, right? And so I do think that it is important to understand that being able to maintain that as a part of the culture is a part of maintaining the structures and the systems that were put in place, again, that did not expect to be diverse, right? And I think until we start actually addressing the fact that so many of the corporations, the organizations, the institutions were built with a particular kind of worker in mind, we understand when we talk about race, they're legal terms. And there are ways in which there's an understanding that Black workers, Black people, Black basically meaning can discriminate against. And so there is a sense of having a hierarchy that is specifically related to labor and basically being asked not to mess with that, not to tamper with it. But when we leave the actual specifics of what is embedded in our laws, what's embedded in our institutions, and we talk about the myths, then we kind of move away from the actual space that people are that they're operating in. So it just feels uncomfortable and you don't know why. You can't actually put your finger on it. And that's the thing that makes people feel like there's something wrong with them. And I want to acknowledge the fact that I think Tammy spoke a little bit earlier about the importance of recognizing the difference between success and justice. When you look at Black women's ability to have children, right, and to live, and for their children to live, what we come to understand is the way in which racism functions with Black women impacts our ability to reproduce. And that the level of stress, and when they've done studies, it didn't matter if you were in the highest corporate position or if you were working, in an unsecure job where you did not have control over your life. That it's the same experience for Black women. And so if we don't actually talk about how these structures and these interlocking oppressions work, then it makes it very challenging to understand other things that are happening in our lives.
I want to talk about power dynamics in terms of hiring these equity officers, chief diversity officers. And Margo, I want to bring you into this conversation because I know you were a diversity director for many, many years. And so I want to talk about whether or not they are problematic, these positions, or if they are truly helping bring diversity into the workplace. I ask that because we had a viewer text us saying that she doesn't want minorities or women to be told they were selected because they were fill in the blank, because they were a woman, because they were Black, because they were Latina. They don't want that. And are these positions creating another way for people to discriminate against employees? And so I also want to say we have about 6 minutes remaining in this Zoom, and if we cut off, we'll come back into the Zoom, okay?
Okay, so yeah, I want to address your viewer who doesn't want people to be told that they were hired or promoted or whatever because they're a woman or Black or whatever. And my answer is, well, then don't say that, because it's not true. In 2020, we've got plenty women and minorities who are qualified from Jump Street for almost any position in any field at any level. And so to say that someone was hired just because of their race or gender is just not true anymore. It could be both, though. I mean, to say that race or gender is not a bona fide factor in selection is also not true, because if your goal is to have a diverse workforce, you have to look at that as long as all other things are equal. So I just think it's a false narrative to say that, because you have a diversity office or an equity officer who's trying to make sure that you have adequate recruiting practices so that you get people before the screening committees and that you have adequate representation on the screening committees so that everything is fair and transparent. Why not? I mean, that's what you have to do. If someone's going to say that we're living in a colorblind society, it's just not true. And I think everything that's going on around us right now shows us that. So why should we act like that in the workplace and just say that everybody, is equal now? So, have at it and give it your best shot. It is still necessary, unfortunately, because we do still have institutional racism, and we can't ignore the history of racism. It is still necessary to have someone who's looking out, reviewing practices and policies, making sure that we have systems in place to just make sure that these qualified minorities and women are being seen and given the opportunity.
Tammy, you seem like you wanted to speak up.
Oh yeah, I didn't know if I was marked for this question. So sometimes I want to tell the listeners or the viewers that sometimes these are not easy answers, right? So the idea that diversity as a concept even exists in workplaces is because there is a problem that needs to be reconciled. So it's not about acknowledging just the history of racism, it's acknowledging the presence of racism. Why is it that your organization lacks diversity? There's been some sort of obstacle to people being able to be in that space. And therefore, when we think about affirmative action or things like that, that should be thought of as a correction to existing inequality and not as a race preference. I might be not in the consensus of scholars who thinks that, I don't have a problem with race being an actual reason and that a person is also hired, because there is an argument that equal treatment is not the same as equity. So treating me as a woman the same way you would treat a male employee and us having the exact same rights to that job doesn't mean that then we have equitable experiences. Because we have data that shows that women are still the primary caregivers. We've got all this data that shows that Black women are facing higher mortality rates in maternity and all these things. That means if you treat me the same as a white male or a white woman, we are still at a disadvantage. It's replaying the existing inequalities that were not only built into the system, but were foundational into in the fabric of the American political economy. So it's about people in these equity offices, when you teach diversity, equity, and inclusion, making sure that you believe and also that you're really working at having people understand that affirmative action is a correction for existing inequalities, and not race happens at hiring. Race happens at birth, and it's ancestral. So we're correcting actual market problems, right?
I would also.
We have less than, before you go, Hazel-Anne, we have less than a minute in this Zoom. I've emailed you all the link to the Zoom again. If you'll jump into that, that would be fantastic. For everybody that's watching on Facebook, stay with us. We're gonna come right back into this, and we're gonna jump in as you're doing this with Gabrielle's question about how do you protect yourself from retaliation when you're seeking to have these conversations prior to having those conversations. So sign out, sign back in, and I'll see you here in a minute.
Okay.
Margo, you're going to want to sign out and then sign back in.
Okay, leave.